town.
Cool. All right. What's good, y'all? Welcome to Science Fiction Has Always Been Political, a panel at Balticon 54. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you to our panelists for being here. And I'm supposed to remind y'all that you can throw money at Balticon if you like it. If you go to bsfs.org/donate.htm. I can't believe I remembered that. So yeah, if you like Balticon, throw money at Balticon. If you don't like money at Balticon, throw money, and then your complaints will be taken more seriously. So yeah, this panel is going to run until it's 7:01 my time, so we're going to run for 49 more minutes to 7:50 Eastern. Yeah, let's introduce some panelists. All right, so I'm the moderator. My name is Mendez. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a writer and a cultural consultant, but I work mostly in analog gaming. I don't do a lot of fiction stuff. Almost all my professional work has focused on political or social issues like orcs, recently mostly orcs. So yeah, I don't consider myself as like too big a science fiction fan, although maybe that's because of past gatekeeping. But I'm excited to be in illustrious company. So let's get to know our panelists. Mary, would you like to start?
Sure. Hi, I'm Mary Fan. I'm a sci-fi fantasy author, mostly of books for young adults. Here's one of my books, Stronger Than a Bronze Dragon. It's a steampunk fantasy. And I'm also the co-editor of the Brave New Girls anthology series about girls in STEM.
That's what's up. All right, Arkady.
Hi, I'm Arkady Martine. I'm a science fiction, fantasy, and horror writer, though mostly people know me for science fiction. This is my first novel, A Memory Called Empire, which came out last year, and which I'm incredibly honored to have won the Compton Crook Award for here.
Super deserves it. It's such a great book.
Congratulations.
In my day job, I actually work in politics now, which is strange, but also great. I'm a policy advisor for the Cabinet Secretary of Energy and Natural Resources for the state of New Mexico.
Cool. Awesome. Sarah.
Hi there. I'm Sarah Pinsker. I write science fiction and fantasy, mostly science fiction, mostly near future. This is my book, A Song for a New Day. And I just turned in another novel that comes out in February, so it's up for pre-order now. That one's called We Are Satellites.
Yay.
And Ada.
Yes, hi. I write science fiction and fantasy known for the Terra Ignota series, which began with Two Like the Lightning, which is a political 25th century SF. I'm now working on a Viking mythology series as well. And I'm also a historian. My current research area is history of censorship. So looking a lot at political discourse over a multi-century time scale.
Very cool. Awesome. So format-wise, we're gonna do some icebreaker questions. Then we're gonna do some discussion, and then there's a Q&A panel where our audience can put questions. You put them there, and then we'll collate them, and I'll pick some to relay to our panelists, and we'll take the last like 15 minutes, I think, of the discussion before wrap up to answer your questions. And then there's also the Zoom chat for just sort of general audience chatter. Try to keep it like at least kind of topical. Yeah, so let's do my icebreaker question. What is a science fiction work with a take on a political issue that you really like? So I'm going to go in reverse order, starting with Ada.
Sorry, what was it, book or story?
Science fiction work. I was pretty vague.
Ah, okay. I really like Micromegas, which is a novelette-length first contact story by Voltaire. So mid-18th century, and in it, aliens from a planet near Sirius and from Saturn come to Earth and make first contact with humans, and the aliens are miles and miles tall, and the humans are itsy bitsy, and And once they establish communications, which is very difficult and takes a lot of effort, they immediately naturally have a conversation about what you would always discuss in a first contact situation, which is whether or not you can prove the existence of providence using experimental science, and whether Descartes or Plato is more correct about the nature of the relationship between the soul and matter, and also whether Thomas Aquinas is right about the centricity of the world. And it's such an amazing glimpse at the way science fiction is always political in ways we often don't register, because our first contact stories don't ask those things. They ask things we think are universal questions about identity or transhumanism or etc. But just like in Voltaire's age, they're the questions of our era. And his are the questions of his era. And it's a really great way of reminding yourself that what feels like a universal question is often really our century's question.
Excellent. Sarah.
Well, I think my general thesis is that all science fiction is political, but if we're going to go with the kind of left field stuff, I'm going to follow Ada's lead actually and go with something really obscure but fun, which is there is a 1964 story by Miriam Allen DeFord, who's this awesome writer who no one talks about anymore, but she was born in she was born in the 1800s. She was a suffragist, and then she got published in a bunch of mystery magazines and in like Galaxy and FNSF. And she had a story in 1964 called the 1980 President, and in which someone points out that every 20 years, starting in like the 1840s, the president who was elected in the year like 1840, 1860, 1880, every 20 years, all the way through 1960, the president died in office in each of those years, which is true, but aliens, but then she uses this and kind of twists it around so that like everyone knows this, and therefore they're kind of fighting to get a different candidate into office because they know that whoever gets into office is going to die under their theory. And so the candidates end up being, even though this was written in 1964, a black man and a white woman, and the story ends bigotry for everyone. Because you can, and
done.
But she just like went for it all. She went for it all.
All right. Arkady.
All
Can
right,
you escalate from that?
No, but I'm going to go
one-upping each other now.
In a different direction slightly, and go for really recent. So a book that I think addressed issues of political governance in a way I hadn't seen in science fiction in a while is Elizabeth Bear's Ancestral Night, which is a space opera and an adventure story and has like a giant creepy spaceship on it, like your standard SF stuff. Cool. But is a lot about how one might imagine a government making decisions which were neither autocratic nor democratic. And this is actually something that I see threaded through Bear's work in general. It like heads back to her book Carnival, which was, I think, in the late aughts of this century, which in some senses considered like government by nanites and disassembly. So I've been really interested to see how that conceptual work on what if not the obvious two interstellar governance styles, what if something else?
Excellent. Mary.
I am going to sound so unlearned compared to everyone else here because I'm going to talk about Star Wars. Specifically, actually, the prequels, which will make me sound extra unlearned. Ooh. But I recently, because, it was May the 4th, rewatched all of them. And having rewatched, 1 through 3, you kind of realize that for all its flaws, like George Lucas had something real to say about, sort of evil growing within a democracy and turning it into an autocracy, into the evil empire. I was like, you know what? I really kind of like that message. Like, I don't, like what happens, of course, but I like that he put that in there because, when it came out, you were just like, okay, this is weird. Like, you think, the good guys are the good guys and the bad guys are the bad guys. But, now in 2020, you're like, oh, so yeah, maybe he had a point.
Nice. I'm gonna continue the like Disney-owned properties theme. I've finally been watching Gargoyles beginning to end. And there's always Gargoyles has some misses. Like it has an Aliens Built Easter Island episode, but I really liked. There's a time travel episode involving the Battle of Britain, which in a 1990s children's afternoon cartoon kind of way draws a parallel between mid-century fascists and modern day populist fascists, which was really cool to see, especially like right now. Awesome. So yeah, wow, icebreakers already, and we're all learning things. All right. So I'm gonna start with a really kind of ham-handed question. How have politics been interwoven with the history of science fiction?
I feel like that's not a panel, that's a large academic anthology.
Yeah, it feels like an AP essay or something like that. But I know some of you all have thoughts on it anyway, so.
Yeah, that's not to say I don't, just that there are many and I have to sort through them, so someone else talk.
I guess I'll just say that I feel like if you are writing a story that's taking place in a speculative world, like you have to build that world. And by necessity, you're going to build politics into it just based on the fact that you live in a society and a society is always political. And so I think like, if you're going to set out to write sci-fi, there's no way to make it not political because you are literally building a different world and putting your own views into it, whatever they may be.
I agree completely. The second you choose one character over another, the second you make your focus, the second you decide which aspects of a given issue that you're focusing on, all of those choices are political. Whose story is it? Whose story isn't it? Is a political question.
And also, as soon as you decide how you think the world would plausibly react to X, because that is very much informed by how you think people operate, how you think, would capitalism break down or not break down? Would the way people labor break down or not break down? A lot of those kinds of political views come out just with when you ask, okay, what would technology X do to a world, or what would first contact do to a world? It then exposes how you assume society functions. A totally unrelated element of that could be a different chapter in the giant anthology. I've been thinking a lot recently, because of my research on censorship, on the way science fiction specifically and also related genre fictions have been used a lot as tools under censorious regimes, because states tend to care less about censoring the media they don't think is serious media. Censors tend to allow to let slip and allow to be published more often and vet less carefully things that they don't think of as being serious media, even though often they have very large influence. So I was just looking through the records of Australia's censorship board through the 1960s, which is case law after case of why we censored Naked Lunch, why we censored this, why we censored that. And there are several of them where they say, the unrealistic fantasy elements of this make it already so divorced from what's going to influence people that we don't have to bother to ban it because nobody's going to be influenced by it. And you also get that, in fact, with Osamu Tezuka, right? With the manga world is able to talk about politics in immediate post-war Japan a bit more freely because the US occupation government didn't care as much about vetting and censoring kids media or science fiction as it did about vetting and censoring those media it perceived as political. So science fiction has very frequently been a tool that people move to have really complicated and rich discussions of political questions, whether it's about legalization of drugs, whether it's about racism, in spaces where the censors of that society will not be on guard for it as much.
Yeah, and I think that ties into one of the ways that science fiction self-describes often is that it's the quote unquote literature of ideas, or the literature of what if. And on a panel I was on yesterday, I kept trying to make the point that all technology was political technology, that all politics was technology. So I think one of the ways that science fiction is and has been and can be a really interesting tool for thinking politically is that it allows the kind of experimentation with technology, and if we use the techne version of technology, to think about politics and political thought and analysis of how humans react to things, which is political thought, as a experimental technology. Change this, what happens?
I use the phrase intellectual technology a lot.
I like that.
When taking students through the history of ideas and going through, like, you know, at this date, you get the notion of anthropogenic progress. And the way people then talk about progress shifts, and inventing anthropogenic progress is just as difficult as inventing a steam engine. It requires all of the correct things to have come together to make that appear, and having it exist beforehand is just as anachronistic as having the steam engine, which can be fine for your narrative, but is neat to engage with and remember.
What's anthropogenic progress?
The idea that humans cause there to be progress, that human action makes the world change over time, as opposed to the idea that, for example, God and providence make the world change, or that nature developing and like the earth gradually maturing and diminishing makes the world change. The idea that human action is making the experience of each generation be different from the generation before, which is an idea that you don't really get before 1620. Earlier notions of progress and development are generally an idea of a naturalist arc or a divine or providential arc, at least in European and Western thought.
Awesome. So y'all answered my next question. What are some examples of works commonly thought apolitical, which are quite the opposite? I think we all agree the answer is all of them. So I'm going to jump straight to some craft stuff. So when we create political science fiction, what are some technical guidelines that you try to follow when you apply to your own work to make political messages sing?
For me, part of it is making sure, and this may just relate to my style of writing, but making sure it's about people, making sure it's about individuals who have a stake in the thing that you're talking about. I know that science fiction is ideas, but for me, those ideas don't land until you are hanging them on people and seeing how they come to pass, and how they change people and how people change them.
I agree. I think politics and sci-fi is the most effective when you're seeing it through the point of view of someone who's experiencing it, when you feel connected to a character who, you know, like you said, has a stake in it, and, you know, it's their lived experience and the reader therefore can live it as well, you know, rather than, you know, some long treatise. Like, I'm sure we've all also read bad examples where it's clear the author wanted to get onto a soapbox and, you know, has this huge long section that is clearly just like, you know, their spiel on whatever. And you know what, they might have a point in there, but it's just not good fiction, because when you're reading it, it brings the story to a grinding halt. And it actually kind of, I feel like, alienates the reader too, because then they feel like they're being lectured at rather than, like, you know, asked to consider a point of view.
There's an organicness to what I think is good political science fiction writing, in that politics don't happen in a vacuum. I mean, we've defined politics incredibly widely, but that also means that politics don't happen without reason. The way people organize themselves into societies, the questions that they ask about what is right and what is wrong, do not occur without socioeconomic pressure, without societal structures which are long-term and changeable. And that kind of, I guess, like, I think of it as a live world, that a world that isn't necessarily about the political question, but contains and naturally gives rise to the political question, is the kind I like to read anyway. And it's the kind I try to write.
I think another thing, and there are lots of things that help make politics sing in stories, but I think one of them is when you also show the interstitial tissue of the development of the political system that you're depicting. And there are a lot of dystopias where suddenly this evil practice is all over the place in Earth, and it doesn't say how you got there. It's just now everybody executes their even-numbered children. And you're like, okay, and then we're going to overthrow this bad regime because it's bad. And you're like, yes, it is. But much more interesting is if it shows the gradual steps by which humanity assented to this thing happening, because then you get into human choice, the way ethics can be pressured, manipulation, so that the same premise, it could still be even-numbered children to get randomly executed, if it has that connective tissue that asks you to think about how you could get to this from a society that doesn't have it, whether this is real world Earth evolving into a dystopia, or whether this is an imagined second world, but having a history, that helps us engage with not just identifying this regime is bad, overthrowing it is good, but the question of how we get to a regime and why resistance, et cetera, might fail along the way.
Kitty. I agree, Ada, and I also think that that doesn't necessarily mean you have to start from the beginning. Like, since we're talking about craft, it's not necessarily saying that you have to include the entire history of how you got to even-numbered children are randomly executed. It's that the characters need to be aware that there is a history.
It has to show somehow, and it could be a conversation, or it could be a character's historian, or it could be there's a holiday about it. It can be anything, and it can be big or it can be small. But if it's there, it enriches what you're experiencing.
I want to ask a follow-up question on this. The discussion about like text and then also comics having their unique relationship to this concept got me thinking. Are there any things about like the medium that you choose to the medium in which a science fiction work is set, which you feel are like optimal for making certain kinds of political points? I don't write a lot of prose fiction, and the craft of writing prose fiction seems like this strange wizardry to me. So I know everybody else at Balticon must talk about that a lot, but this seems like a very interesting and new topic to me. So
it's not exactly medium, but different subgenres have robust and well-developed internal tools that can be very well optimized for particular types of political conversation. It's very easy, for example, to, in a shoujo manga, have a very particular kind of conversation about gender, using the tools that that genre has developed over time, that the readers of that genre are going to recognize, and that you can sort of skip past the 101 level of the conversation to the 202 level because the readers know that. You can't then use those tools in a different medium where your readers haven't necessarily caught up with you, though you can borrow some of them. But I think one of the great things about genre fiction is that because we have subgenres, and we have the subgenres that are, you know, travel fantasy, and we have epic fantasy, and we have grimdark, and we have Lovecraft, each of them has developed a set of tools which can be used to talk about politics, which get added to over time, especially when people do deconstructions or reversals, that then make it really easy to plunge in and do the 202 level instead of the 101 level, addressing whatever that particular genre has focused on. Well, that particular subgenre may actually have fairly weak inbuilt tools for a different political conversation that might be harder to have in the same micro medium.
Huh. That's cool, because it also has to do with like the political history of the genre itself then.
Right. superhero comics, for example, are very good at having conversations about secret identity and the ethics of hiding things, and also about the relationship between power in civilian hands and power in government hands.
But there's also the fascinating thing that goes on there, where most so many superheroes were created out of particular there were a whole lot of anti-fascist Jewish creators whose works are then turned around now whatever 60 years later, and they say, oh, like, wouldn't it be cool and edgy if Captain America was actually secretly a Nazi, all those things that they think are subversions, but they're at some level they're just like they're grain. I don't know, there's something inherently wrong with some of those subversions, in my opinion, because they're going against the whole,
against the tradition of the engagement and activism that the shapers of the genre.
Thank you. Yes, that.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times it is those inbuilt genre signals that make certain kinds of conversations easier to have in certain genres. It's easier to have a conversation about imperialism in space opera than it is in shoujo manga, I think. I don't necessarily know enough shoujo manga.
It's a great example of they have tools optimized for these conversations, and there are a lot of earlier texts that you can meta refer back to, and whether it's appropriate or deconstruct, that have addressed those questions.
Yeah. Which means that sometimes you can do really interesting, surprising things, like putting a political conversation that quote unquote belongs to a particular set of genre signals into a completely different set of genre signals. And if you can pull it off, it's really powerful. Which actually, I think is what the Hunger Games did in a lot of ways. The political signals there are about fashion. And you have to think back to when the Hunger Games were new, and like there wasn't all of the YA that came after the Hunger Games that used those same concepts and ideas about constructed appearance and political manipulation. That was something that I had only previously seen in television drama, and mostly television drama from Korea and China.
It's interesting that you bring up the Hunger Games, because I recall reading that Suzanne Collins was inspired to write it, not because of Battle Royale, which everyone assumes she was, but because she was just flipping through channels one day, and 1 minute she's on this silly reality show, and the next minute it's broadcasting the war in Iraq. And just that juxtaposition really struck her, and that's what kind of inspired her to write this book that's about horrible violence, but that's dressed up as entertainment. And
sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that I do think it worked better as film, because kind of TV and that visual medium was the inspiration. I know that's kind of controversial. Everyone says, oh, the book is always better. But in this case, I actually think the film was better.
I completely agree with you, actually. But has to do with weird personal idiosyncrasies about first-person YA narrators, which have nothing to do with this panel.
I also think the conversations people have about which one is better is always even better than either one, because it makes people think more thoroughly and analyze more deeply the versions that exist.
So I wanted to throw one last question from my boring outline out there before we go to audience questions. And it is, do you ever get personal out of character backlash for your work's political messages, or even just for talking about this topic in other people's work? And so how has that played out for you, and how do you keep yourself sane and healthy through that?
So I guess I'll say I never meant to be political when I set out to write genre fiction. It was just what I loved growing up. I grew up watching Star Wars like everyone else. But then when I sat down to write a space opera, just the fact that I'm the one writing it became a political act. And I didn't mean for it to be, but I'm in this country and I am a minority, and just the fact that I exist is political. And so even though I didn't mean to make any statement when I started out, like I just couldn't avoid it. And I guess the way I deal with it is just, you know, sometimes I choose to engage, sometimes I don't. And it's kind of just knowing that it's also okay not to engage. Like you don't have to have a stance on everything, or even if you do, you don't have to broadcast it all the time. Like you are allowed to keep certain things to yourself, even though you're expected to speak out, just because it might just be better for you.
I think I've been lucky to avoid a lot of backlash, and I don't really have an answer to why, because I've always been fairly political and always been out as queer and active in those spaces as well. So I don't have an answer to why I you know, and I'll knock wood that I don't know, but that's not very articulate, just an answer.
I've also been relatively lucky so far, but I think that's probably because I'm new, and it hasn't caught up with me yet, or the politics that I'm writing about are sufficiently, they're not divorced from politics right here, right now, but they look like they are. So maybe people haven't realized how political my book is, and the book that comes after it is even more so. But I try not to talk about politics qua politics in public social media spaces. I mean, I'm also enormously out as queer and Jewish, but that's just me being me. I don't talk about politics, really.
I think one thing I've definitely learned very viscerally over the past year is that the ability to appear apolitical is a form of power and privilege.
Yeah.
Cool. Anyone have any last thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I have friends who vet stuff, so I don't see stuff that's gonna hurt a lot, which is just necessary to set up when your stuff has a lot of politics in it, I think. What I've observed has been that while people being nasty is painful, for me at least, what's much more painful is if it's, you know, my first series does a lot of weird stuff with gender. This is a future society that has handled gender in really odd ways that are not what we would want, that are not retrogressive either. They're just a really different, strange way for gender to operate. And then over the course of the series, people are questioning that and pushing at that, and that's shifting. And there will sometimes be people who aren't, you know, being sexist and insisting that gender be normalized, but who are people who have been abused about gender a lot and are uncomfortable and being, you know, experiencing real pain from looking at a thing where gender works weirdly, but not in a way that's better. And so it'll be somebody who I think of as an ally and a person who I want to, you know, identify with and whose politics I share, who will express being hurt by the thing. Generally having taken away from it a message that I never intended to be in it, and that, you know, many test readers and beta readers of many genders and fluid deities, etc., also didn't see in it. But I think there's such a thing as being so damaged in an area because you've been hurt so much in it that you get hurt when anything goes near it because there's a bruise there, even if it's not actually an attack, even if it's a hug. And watching that is the hardest part for me, because this is somebody that I wanted to give a hug to, right? I don't know if that's a useful answer, but.
All right. Yeah, I'm loving these answers so far. I want to jump to a couple of the audience questions, make sure we get to some of those before we finish. So one that I saw earlier on from Henry Gibbons was, is there a, and I'm going to elaborate on this a little bit, is there a difference between how sci-fi and fantasy genres handle politics and advocacy? And I'm going to tack on a, should there be a difference?
to reverse what is commonly said at 4th Street Fantasy Convention, all fantasy is science fiction anyway, so no.
I think there are a lot of fantasies with, but also science fiction. Sorry, this is me thinking out loud. There's a lot of feudal structures in fantasy, but then I'm thinking there's also empires and such in science fiction. So where am I going? I think there's a potential to be regressive in both, and it depends on where you take them. You can have those things and you can make a commentary on them, or you can have those things and lean into them as if it's those were the days. And I think depending on which way you go with it, you're going to have a very different work. The Goblin Emperor by Katherine Addison is a marvelous work of fantasy about an emperor and a fantasy world, and it feels anything but regressive. So you can do either, you can do both, and it just depends on the slant you give it.
Sort of paraphrase springboarding on that, it's that when you're writing sort of standard in the stereotypical bullseye of each, there are different political problems that you definitely want to vet, like check your work for. And when it's science fiction, you really want to check for imperialism. You really want to check for baggage of US supremacist ideas from the Cold War, because those are very likely to have accidentally sneaked in to a piece of science fiction just because they're so deep in the DNA of the genre. For fantasy, it'll be aristocratic, anti-populist, and pseudo-feudal, monarchist ideas that are equally in the DNA and likely to leak through. So you want to be extra analytic of, is my story repeating this? And the things you want to watch for in each one are slightly different, which also goes for different subgenres, right? What you're looking for in vampire stories will be sort of feudal generational stuff, which has its own politics, etc.
I just want to agree with that. I guess what we think of as sci-fi and fantasy, necessarily comes with a history. And, fantasy tends to come kind of out of mythology, which tends to be, like you said, aristocratic. It tends to be very much about, those royal bloodlines and, those ideas that were, in vogue, way long ago when, these stories were supposed to take place. And so when you're writing fantasy, there's a tendency to just jump onto that tradition without questioning it, without even thinking about it, just be like, this is what fantasy is. And then sci-fi, of course, really became popularized, sort of after the whole era of, Western, colonialism and, manifest destiny, this idea of, technological superiority. And so you tend to come with that baggage, the idea that there's one power that, deserves to have the power because they're better somehow because of what they've done. And so I guess, either or, like, you can, both of them come with baggage, but it's different kind of baggage. You just have to be aware of that.
Excellent. We got another question from Eliana Gonzalez. So this one is, when you create these political tensions or the worlds in your books, are there any time periods or specific places that you use as inspiration? Are there any you think haven't drawn too much attention in literature that you wish would be used more?
I think Arkady should go first.
Okay. The book I wrote and the series the book is in is enormously built out of middle period Byzantium in space.
I'm shocked to discover this.
I know, right? But it's not just middle period Byzantium. One of the things that I did immediately when I was putting the sort of aesthetic and thematic questions of that empire together was to try to get as much Christianity out of it as I could, which is hard because middle period Byzantium is incredibly Christian. Like, that's part of the deep DNA. And to do that, I kind of had to reach for some other inspirations and other places to look. And I ended up looking at the Mexica, the Aztec Empire. I looked at the Pax Mongolica, the sort of post-Genghis Khan giant Mongol sphere. And I looked a lot at American cultural imperialism to fill in some of the gaps that I had created by trying to excise a religious ideology. So it's very piecemeal, but it comes out of having spent a decade doing Byzantine history. And now, Ada, it has to be your turn because it's only fair.
My answer is not a particular time period that's untapped, but pick any time and place and try to find a social history book on it or a cultural history book on it, but especially social history books on it, because usually the watered down generic popular understanding of whatever time and place it is will have been shaped in the periods when history was dominantly asking questions about politics, war, great men, and biography. And if you therefore look for the newer subsections of history, especially social history and cultural history, which get at all of the stuff that was erased and sort of left out of the earlier narrative, then whatever time period it is and whatever place it is, you're going to be getting at the really bizarre bits of it that you didn't realize were there. I was looking at a social history of the War of the League of Cambrai yesterday, and it was the only account I'd ever seen that included the detail that in one battle the victory was declared because the victors succeeded in capturing a wagon which contained a piece of the True Cross, Holy Thorn, the Virgin Mary's vest, one of the limbs of Saint Denis, and a large illuminated manuscript of pornographic pictures of naked women. And because this was such a great treasure trove, that meant that that side of the battle had won. And like, that's not
They didn't already have one?
That's not in your Renaissance as being a thing that would be in the same box with each other, right? But it's when you look at those newer cultural and social history approaches that you get the missing connective tissue of our older, watered down to just high politics narratives.
I want to touch on something that's probably not considered, political oftentimes because it's just so taken for granted, and that's our sort of Western tendency toward individualism. Like, a lot of the stuff we take for granted as being good storytelling comes from a very specific point of view, which is, the individual, the protagonist, being an active person who, goes out and goes forth and completes an adventure. And then, this often gets criticized as bad writing when you have a protagonist or main character who is, passive, who, consults with their people and, is more kind of, I guess, collectivist in a way. And I do think there is room for more stories like that. Like, I feel like there is a knee-jerk reaction towards stories like that to say, oh, this is bad writing. Oh, this was poorly plotted because the main character is passive. The main character doesn't do anything. And I'm like, you know what? That's actually a political thing to say, that you have to be, very active, that you have to be like, that one great man kind of thing. So it's not traditionally considered political, but it is something to think about.
I think that's a really great point. One of the, as a cultural consultant working in Asian topics, one of the things that comes up most as like the West's favorite first thing to learn about Asia is that Asian cultures are collectivist societies. And the more I see that, the more I think that's actually just a lot of Western societies are really obsessed with individualism and like moving out of your mom's house when you're 18. And that gives a certain, maybe a skewed perspective on collectivism or what collectivism is.
And also the generational relationships. Like you see in a lot of Western media, Western literature, the idea of moving out of the house at 18 and never looking back. And it's like considered a shame if you're still living with your mother at, age 25. Whereas in, other cultures, it's like, of course you live with your mom till you're 25. Like, what are you talking about? If you're not married yet, why would you move out of your mom's house? Or you do get married and mom moves in with you.
So I'm gonna do something awful moderation wise and ask a really spicy question for our last one. From Bugsy Bryant. This panel was inspired by an author who asked if they could participate in Balticon, who prized themselves on writing apolitical science fiction, but a quick look at their works indicated they just used the term political to mean politics they don't agree with. If you could say something pretty pithy to someone who professes this attitude, what would it be?
I can't avoid politics because it's written on my face.
Yeah, I think I'll reiterate that all science fiction is political. Every choice you make, if you're writing space opera about white dudes, that's a political choice too. Every choice that we make about characters feeds back to the politics and the choices we make.
Everyone is embedded in a political culture consistently and always. So you can't write apolitical science fiction.
I would say read some science fiction written more than 80 years before now. And if it doesn't feel weirdly dated and colored by the politics of its day, right, it's gonna feel like that. You see it. And our science fiction is all gonna read like that 80 years from now, because every era's politics, expectations, social stuff is different, and that saturates it. And there's nothing that's 80 years old or more where you don't see the political difference between then and now. That's what it means for a thing to be political. It doesn't mean you're consciously advancing an agenda necessarily. You might not be consciously advancing an agenda, but you are writing something that is embedded in, connected to, and either reinforcing or deconstructing different elements of the politics of your moment, which shapes the questions you ask in the work in the first place. Otherwise, we'd still be writing about whether Thomas Aquinas or Descartes is correct about the nature of the soul every time we write a first contact story.
And if you look at Frankenstein, you know, the founding works of the genre, if you only see a monster story, then you're not looking hard enough anyway.
Well, and a person who wrote
unfortunately, I must cut us off because we are within 5 minutes of the end. But thank you to our panelists for a totally awesome discussion. Like, somehow we did this in 45 minutes. Thank you to our chat. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but Discord's there for you to have arguments in, have fun. But before we break, I want to know, all of our panelists, where can we find you on the internet, and what's something that you're working on that is coming out soon that you want to tell us about? For me, I'm at jamesmendezhodes.com, and if you want to read about like how orcs are very political, and Thousand Arrows is a tabletop role-playing game about the Japanese Warring States period that's coming out later this summer. But more importantly, panelists, let's start with Ada.
You can find me at adapalmer.com and also on Twitter. I'll put the Twitter in the thing. And you can find my blog at exurbe.com, where I talk about history and a lot about history of thought. And I've got an essay that just came out in the latest issue of Uncanny Magazine, where I'm discussing onto my research on the relationship between censorship and science fiction. So if you're interested in the history of that and the way science fiction works as a political tool to affect our engagement with censorship, etc., that essay is in Uncanny Magazine. You can buy it to support them now, or it'll be free online on June 2nd.
SarahPinsker.com.
Awesome.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
SarahPinsker.com, at Sarah Pinsker on Twitter, and I've got my novel, A Song for a New Day, is out right now, but also I've got a novelette coming from Tor.com in June called Two Truths and a Lie.
Sweet. Arkady.
I'm at arkadymartine.net and at Arkady Martine on Twitter. And the sequel to A Memory Called Empire, which is called A Desolation Called Peace, comes out next March, and you can pre-order it now.
What's up? And Mary.
My website is maryfan.com. Check out my book, Stronger Than a Bronze Dragon. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram as @astralcult. And my next two books are actually anthologies that I'm editing. One is the next installment of the Brave New Girls series about girls in STEM. And one is called Badass Moms, which is about exactly what it sounds like.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, everybody. I don't think a lot of the panelists can actually go to Discord because we all have pre-existing arrangements to go drink with somebody. But you all should totally have fun in Discord. Thank you again for coming. Thanks to all the panelists.
I don't know what you're doing.
Oh, okay. All right. Peace.
Thank you.